Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's your Kiwi Connection here, Kidmo7, and today we have a first. We're putting up the Toxic 280X against the R9 290 Tri-X, both from Sapphire. So this is going to be our first 280X versus 290 video. So this one will be quite interesting. The Tri-X is debatably the most popular R9 290, and the Toxic is incredibly popular as well. So these are two very popular cards, very similar looking from a distance cards, so it'll probably be quite interesting to see how they do. So let's get right into it. So first, the differences between these two cards. So they're both 28nm GPUs in them, but the difference is the 280X is the same as the 7970, it's running the Tahiti GPU in it. Whereas the 290 is running the Hawaii GPU, so more modern GPU. I don't like to get too technical because I don't want to throw anybody off, but the Hawaii is a more advanced, newer, better GPU, basically. Now, considering that, the Tahiti GPU in the 280X is basically fully fledged. It's about as developed as it can be. With the 290, as you know, is a cut down version of the 290X. You know, fewer stream processors. It's just, say, 5% less, 5 to 10% less of a 290X. So there's that bit of a difference there, but both of these cards are really good, and of course the Toxic 280X is the best 280X I've tested thus far. So carrying on with the GPU, there's a difference in speed obviously. So the Toxic goes up to 1150 MHz on boost, whereas the Tri-X goes to 1000. Now keep in mind, these are kind of pointless to say, but I'm throwing them in anyways, because these are two completely different GPUs. And with the memory as well, the Toxic has, same as 7970, 3 GB of RAM, video memory, and the 290 has 4 GB, same as the 290X. So there's a bit of difference here, but also a big difference in that the 280X has a 384-bit memory bus compared to the 512-bit memory bus on the 290. So then, again, you know, a bit better. And that leads to the differences in the memory speed, with the Toxic 280X coming in at 6,400 MHz memory speed compared to the Tri-X's 5,200 MHz. Once again, these are different types of memory, so it's, you know, trying to keep it basic, but these don't really mean that much. I'm just throwing it out there so everybody knows. But take it with a grain of salt, basically. So that leads to the cooler. So these are pretty much the same, except for about 3 differences. So the middle fan on the Toxic is slightly smaller for some reason, whereas on the Tri-X all 3 fans are the same. So I don't understand why that is, but for whatever reason the middle fan is smaller on the Toxic, and so that might play a bit to its, you know, to the Tri-X's advantage in terms of cooling. And also there is a backplate on the 280X Toxic and no backplate on the Tri-X, which is kind of funny, but I'm thinking that's probably because they put a backplate on the Vapor X 290, so maybe they wanted to the Vapor X to be sort of like a more upscale model, I suppose, where the Toxic is the most upscale model of the 280Xs, so maybe something like that. And the last thing is that there's a little bit of color scheme differences on this card, but not much. Just a few things different. And that leads us into size. So they're pretty much the same color, so they're pretty much the same size. The Toxic is 308 millimeters long. The Tri-X is 305 millimeters long, so there's nothing in it. Width-wise, they're exactly the same, 113 millimeters wide. And height-wise, surprisingly, well, no, actually, thinking about it, the Toxic is 41 millimeters high to the Tri-X is 38 millimeters high. Now, it's not because the cooler's higher. I'm guessing that's just because of the backplate. That would probably, you know, add to it, that 3 millimeters. I'd say that's probably it. Now, okay, let's go straight into it then. Benchmarks. So obviously 2 different cards. The 280X Toxic is about the top of the 280Xs, from the ones I've tested so far anyways. The Tri-X is probably the second top so far that I've tested of the R9 290s, with only the PCS Plus Power Color ranking higher, in my own personal opinion. So let's jump straight in. First up, Furmark. So this is running 4 times MSA, 15 minutes, 1080p. The Toxic 280X, 24 frames per second average. The Tri-X, 35 frames per second. So, yeah, that's pretty good. A bit of a jump up there for the Tri-X. Now into Unigine Valley. This is on the Extreme HD preset. The Toxic 280X, 48 frames per second. The Tri-X 290, 58.8 frames per second average. So once again, we're seeing about 10, maybe slightly more frames per second better on the Tri-X. Now Heaven 4.0, DirectX 11, everything maxed out. On the Toxic 280X, 39.1 frames per second average. It's DirectX 11. On the Tri-X 290, 52.1 frames per second. So that's a more substantial lead that time, the Tri-X says. Then Heaven 4.0 again, OpenGL. Once again, everything maxed out. The Toxic 280X, 32.1. The Tri-X, 37.2. Tri-X 290. So that was a bit closer, but that's kind of to be expected with OpenGL. Now to Tomb Raider. This is everything maxed out without VSync, 1080p. The Toxic 280X, 70 frames per second flat average. The Tri-X 290, 78.1 frames per second average. So that was actually a lot closer than I thought it would be. I thought the Tri-X would once again be about 10 frames, but that time it was only 8. So, but still a decent difference. Now last up, BioShock Infinite. This is everything maxed out without VSync. The Toxic 280X, 99.4 frames per second average. The Tri-X, 113.9. So the Tri-X 290 there really showed. That was, pretty much 14 frames per second better than the 280X. So on average, it's about 10 frames per second better on the Tri-X R9 290, and that's to be expected when you're going from the top 280X to a pretty high-end 290. There's going to be a bit of a jump, and 10 frames per second is pretty good. So I was kind of, that's what I was expecting. But what was going to be more interesting to me was the temperatures. So that's what we'll get into right now. So in the Furmark test, the highest temperature I saw on the 280X Toxic was 73 degrees Celsius at 64% fan speed. So that was pretty good. On the Tri-X, I saw 79, the same test in Furmark, 79 degrees centigrade, but only at 46% fan speed max, so a lot lower fan speed. Now, so the Toxic is lower, the Toxic 280X is lower, but let me just tell you this. These are two different GPUs, as I explained earlier. The thermal limit on the Tahiti GPU and the 280X is 85. They go to 85, that's it. The thermal limit on the 290 is 95 degrees. So the 290 can go 10 degrees hotter. So you got to keep that in mind, that it has that sort of extra space. Now into the highest temperature I saw in Unigine Heaven. This was during my DirectX 11 benchmark. The highest on the Toxic 280X was 68 degrees. The highest on the Tri-X was 74 degrees. So both these cards are very good. The cooling, I'd say probably, all things considered, considering that the Hawaii GPU actually runs a lot hotter than the Tahiti as well, as I explained just before. I'd say these probably even out to be about the same. Maybe the Tri-X just a tiny bit better. But they're pretty much the same cooler, so it's pretty much the same cooling. But I'm very impressed with both. Both cards cool very well, and there's nothing to complain about here. Now, to noise. So, as I explained in my previous video, the 280X Toxic I had the infamous rattling noise from the shrouding. So I have to take that into consideration. Although, if you buy one, I doubt it'll be like that. I think I just got unlucky, and a few other people have. But if you do, I'm like 90% sure you can RMA it for that reason. So don't worry about it. But just taking into considering the fan noise, I'd say these cards are very similar, at least at idle. They're very similar, and on load there's probably not a lot in it, so I'll let you decide for yourself. So this is what the 280X Toxic sounds like at idle. And here is the R9290 Tri-X at idle. Now here is the 280X Toxic on load, but remember this is rattling, so you know, keep that in mind. And here is the Tri-X R9290 at load. So not a lot there. They're about the same. Honestly, I can't say one's better than the other in terms of noise, and of course my 280X rattled, so that kind of wasn't too good either, but I'm sure if you got one it wouldn't. So overall, what do I say is better? Well, it's pretty obvious to go straight to the Tri-X because it won in the benchmarks and in most other ways. And I probably would still pick the Tri-X as the overall winner, but remember there is a price difference here. So depending on where you live, I don't really like putting up prices because they always change. But right now, it's about, in New Zealand, it's about $100, $120 difference to get a Tri-X over a 280X Toxic Tri-X 290. So, yeah, but would I say it's worth the extra money? Yes, I would. It's just a more modern GPU. It's got more video memory. It's just an all-round, it's just a better card. And paying about an extra $100 for another extra 10 frames is pretty decent. At least for me anyway, but that is my personal opinion. But at least now you know that if you're going to pick a 280X Toxic or a 290 Tri-X, there's about 10 frames per second. This is obviously an average, and you know it could change, but just as a general figure, it's about 10 frames difference what you're paying for each card. So you got the extra money, then go for that Tri-X. But if you're a bit strapped for cash or you're building to a budget, the 280X Toxic is still a really good card, so consider that too. And Sapphire, you've just done such a great job on these cards. I just cannot say it enough. I'm not a fanboy, and I have all different cards, and I've never been a fan to one brand or one whatever, but every card I test from Sapphire just seems to do really well. They seem to put in the effort, where some of these Aces cards especially are just not that good. It just seems like they got lazy, where Sapphire, it just never seems like they got lazy with their cards. So I've been very impressed by them. So that's going to round out this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was educational. And I'll be putting out a few more reviews soon. I have the XFX R9290 on the way, so that'll be coming up maybe next week. So you'll be able to look forward to seeing that. Anyways, I thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.